Hello everybody, this is the first video for our series of videos on chapter 2. This is the data of macroeconomics, and this is coming out of the Mankiw text called Macroeconomics. So for intermediate macro, we're going to dive in with this introductory stuff that should mostly be a review from principles of macro, and we're going to hit these main three topics in the way that we measure macroeconomic phenomenon primarily, which are GDP, gross domestic product, inflation, and unemployment, which is the most common way which we measure the labor market health. So let's jump in here. We're going to go ahead and start with GDP. So gross domestic product. The most commonly used statistics in macro, we use this to measure total income. We use this to measure economic health of our country, of other countries, to compare our economic growth over time and to compare our economic levels and growth to other countries as well. So definitely one of the most widely used macroeconomic variables that we have. So this is measuring several things at one time. First, it's the total market value, the market value of total production. The market value of total production. Okay, and because it is a value, that's going to be denominated in dollars. So the market value of total production within an economy. It's also the total incomes of everyone in the economy. And it's the total expenditure on an economy's output. Total expenditure on an economy's output. Okay, and generally we think about these things at a countrywide level, although we could also think about them at regional and sub-regional levels as well. If you wanted to think about the GDP of any given state, right? You could look at total incomes, total expenditure, the market value of total production, and again, all of these are in dollar signs. So GDP is a value. And if we're simplifying a bit to a single large country or macro economy, we can generally think of total income being equal to total expenditure. So although at an individual level, your income may be different than how much you spend, if you save that and that gets loaned out to somebody else is doing that spending. And so if you aggregate this up to a countrywide level, then total income is going to be more roughly equal to total expenditure. Once we start adding international trade into the mix, this doesn't necessarily have to hold at a single country level. Once you go to a global level, then by definition it needs to be true that the total income is being spent somewhere else on expenditure. So the broader the region that you're dealing with, the more likely this equality is to hold. Okay. So let's define GDP next, and we're going to go into a couple of the nuanced parts of this definition. So GDP, it's the market value of all final goods and services, and I'm going to abbreviate that with GNS, goods and services, all final goods and services produced within a given geography. Produced within a given geography, most commonly countries or a country, in a given period of time. Okay, for example, a quarter or a year. Okay, so all final goods and services produced within a given geography in a given period of time. And we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about this idea of all and this idea of final goods and services. And then the other parts can hold, whether we're talking about countries, regions, quarters, years, months. Most commonly, quarters are measured quarterly GDP and annual GDP. But you could look at it at a couple other time intervals. Okay, but all goods and services does not include everything that's sold in a year, for example. So let's talk about some of those. Used items. Used items already were made and produced and sold within a given period of time as a new item. And so a used item shouldn't be counted twice in GDP. And so only the new production gets counted. Next is imputed value. And this idea of imputed value can come from a multiple number of sources. So let's talk about a couple of them. Goods and services, GNS. Goods and services produced at home. Okay, these can be, some examples of these could be homemade meals. So if you're cooking your dinner yourself instead of going out to a restaurant, that production is not included in GDP. But the restaurant meal would be included in GDP. So homemade meals, homemade house care, lawn care from your kids, for example. Lawn care from kids. Let's say your kids. Possibly even your neighbor kid. But this kind of informal production that doesn't get counted as GDP, and that's this idea of imputed value. And one more idea of imputed value that we'll talk about are informal markets. Okay, and this would include black markets. These are things like drugs and illicit, let's say, goods and services. If it's not being traded within the formal economy, it's not going to be included in normal GDP. And then we can just say informal markets, things like, street markets. And let's put especially in developing countries. So much less common in developed countries, but if you have street markets where you just have individual producers selling their produce along the street side, there's no kind of real formality behind it. It's not being regulated. It's not likely being taxed. If it's not part of the formal economy, that's also categorized under this idea of imputed value and does not get included into the formal GDP calculations. Okay, so that's this idea of all goods not being included, used items and imputed value goods and services and the next is final goods and services. So here we're talking about only the final good being included in GDP, and I think one of the easiest examples here is to think about cars. A new car that's being manufactured is going to be buying, say, tires. Okay, those tires that are bought to produce the car are not included in the GDP calculation. Only the final good, the final car, is included. That way, you're not double counting. The tires. So here, this idea of value added is useful, and the same idea, like the cars, we're going to use this example with bread and all of its intermediate inputs as well. So our little formula for value added is the value of output minus the value of intermediate goods. Okay. And so if we take this simplified example here, we have a farmer. The farmer produces some wheat and sells it to the miller for $1. The miller takes the flour, buys it for $1 and converts it into bread. And then the baker takes the bread, takes the flour, converts it into bread, and sells it to the consumer for $6. I think I said that wrong, but the farmer takes the wheat, sells it to the miller makes it into flour, sells it to the baker who makes the bread. And so what's our value added? The farmer, they started with nothing. You could consider the seeds, and the seeds being some fraction of a cent. But let's start with nothing and say that the farmer produced $1 value added. And then the miller took something that was worth $1 and through their own process made that $1 thing into a $3 thing. And so they added $2, right? Just 3 minus 1. So they added $2 of value. And then similarly, the baker takes the flour, turns it into bread. And the final good, the bread costing $6, the baker contributed 3 value added dollars to that process. And so one other way of calculating GDP is looking at the summation of the value add across the supply chain. 1 plus 2 plus 3 is 6. So GDP is 6. It's also the expenditure, the total expenditure from the consumer at the end. Okay, and the consumer, they're not adding any value. They're just consuming the final product. So their value add is 0. Okay, so again, kind of two ways there to see GDP being calculated. 1, through the final expenditure, as we talked about, and 2, through this new idea of value add. Okay, so again, it's important not to include the intermediate inputs in the GDP calculation, only the final good, right? And that comes back up to our definition. Final, all final goods and services. Okay, so that was our definition of GDP. We'll do one quick bit on gross domestic product versus gross national product. And after we do that, we're going to talk about the components of GDP. Okay, so GDP versus GNP. GDP, the one we use most commonly, gross domestic product, is all production happening within the borders of the country. So in our case, if we're talking about American GDP, within the US, happening within the United States. Regardless of whether or not it's a foreign firm or it's held by a foreign company, if the production happens in the country, it's included in gross domestic product. If it's a good or a service that's produced by an American, no matter where they're located, that would be included in gross national product. So gross national product is only production by Americans, whether that American is within the borders of the United States or whether they're in Germany or some other country. gross national product is U.S. firms located anywhere. And so, quick example here, Ford's contribution to gross domestic product and gross national product. All cars made by Ford anywhere, all cars made by Ford anywhere, because Ford is an American firm, no matter whether they produce a car here or in Asia or in Europe or wherever else, that's going to be included in gross national product, GNP. Okay, whereas all cars made within the United States, that's GDP. Okay, same if it was Toyota or Volkswagen or any other foreign car company, they have some plants within the United States. Those cars, those foreign cars made within our borders get counted as gross domestic product. So ultimately, the reason why we're more interested in gross domestic product than gross national product is because we're trying to, politicians are trying to conduct policies that are going to bring jobs and prosperity to the people within the country, primarily. And those are going to be the ones who there's a more immediate effect on, and certainly the bulk of Americans and American firms, let's say Americans, are within the United States. So this emphasis on gross domestic product, even if we're increasing production of a Volkswagen car manufacturing plant, but that plant is within the United States, that's still going to lead to American jobs. And so what we're really thinking about is measuring national income in the way that's going to be most indicative of production happening within the country. So that's why we primarily use GDP. Okay, so in the next video, we're going to jump into each of the component parts of GDP and look at a little bit of data to show kind of what makes up our economy and kind of how that's changed over time. So we're going to leave it off here and pick it up there on the next one.